afternoon, everybody, and welcome back to the second panel that we have for this afternoon, which is actually the book launch proper. And we have with us this very distinguished panel of editors, the people who really did the work to get the book together. And it's my pleasure to introduce to you Michael Samuel. And Michael's going to tell us a little bit about himself just now. Rubby Dhunpath on the left, and I've left the best for last, Nyna, Amin. So Michael, I'm going to ask you to introduce yourself first before we say anything about the book.
Hello everyone, I'm involved with postgraduate education, largely supporting doctoral education in the School of Education. And as part of my fortune, have the opportunity of knocking into a whole lot of people all the time. And my job is to make sure they bots well.
They box well, okay. Rubby.
Oh, okay. I'm Rubby Dhunpath. For my sins, in some other life, I am the Director of Teaching and Learning at UKZN. My job is really quite undefined. So I have fun most of the time. But part of what I do is support academics to be good teachers. And of course, one of my primary responsibilities is to initiate and support curriculum transformation in higher education.
Thank you, Rubby. Nyna.
Hi, I'm Nyna Amin from the School of Education, where I'm supposed to be working in curriculum studies, but I do a whole lot of other things. I'm also involved, like Michael, in postgraduate education, particularly masters and the doctoral program. And at the moment, I'm doing running talk shows at different institutions in the country. Obviously, when everyone's grappling with decolonization and you pretend to know a little bit, people suddenly tag the word expert to you and they invite you to come and say a whole lot of nonsense about it, which I'm quite enjoying, cognitively damaged as I am. So that's just more or less what I'm doing, tinkering with curriculum. Not very successfully though.
Thank you, thank you. So I think they've been rather humble in their introductions. Those of us who know these editors know that they do far more than what they're just telling us here. But we'll hear a little bit about that just now. The point of this panel is actually to get a sense of the genesis of the book, why they felt that it was important to put this book together, and also to understand some of the contents and how the book came together. After this panel, we're going to have a panel with some selected contributors who will then tell us something more about their own chapters in the book. But I think we can begin with you, Rubby, and perhaps you'll tell us a little bit about the genesis of the book, how it began.
So the book actually began, I would say, 9-10 years ago. That is conceptualizing a book which for me, I needed to desperately understand what I was doing at UKZN. Because when I took up my job as Director of Teaching and Learning, one of my key responsibilities was to interrogate student access and student progression. And it became soon apparent to me that there was a tendency amongst both academic staff and the leadership to externalize the problem. And that is to say, the students were being pathologized rather than having the university take a critical look at itself. And so I began to initiate a dialogue and a discourse around where is the problem? When we talk about access to higher education, are we talking about underprepared students, or might we conceptualize it as underprepared institutions? And so I initiated the discussion amongst various academics around the university, and what happened was that the dialogue turned into a book, and I edited a book with Renuka Vital called Alternative Access to Higher Education, Underprepared Students or Underprepared Institutions. And indeed, the book gave me some of the tools to begin to engage with the massive task of curriculum reconstruction and asking, as Gayatri indicated earlier, the hard question about who is this curriculum for? Of course, the task ahead was far bigger than I was, if you'll forgive the pun.
You weren't going to say anything?
And I felt a profound sense of despair. And I suppose I had to concede at the time that perhaps I was cognitively damaged. And I then turned to the humanities for the solutions. And I invited Gayatri, and God bless her soul, she willingly accepted the invitation. And I think the rest of it is history. She came, she wooed us, but more importantly for me, she gave me a language in which, a vocabulary in which to understand what I was trying to do and failed to do and could do. And I consulted with my two conspirators here, and I think we were equally enamored with the notion of cognitive damage. We identified with that. It appealed to our souls. And so thereafter the book wrote itself.
As a contributor, I can say that's not true. not with all the hounding that we got from the editors. Nyna, perhaps, I mean, Rubby has already hinted at this, but perhaps you want to tell us a little bit about the idea of cognitive damage. I remember Gayatri saying she doesn't like speaking in sound bites. And but all of us bit on this. I remember at the conference where Gayatri gave the keynote address, the notion of cognitive damage seemed to speak to us all and became, as you rightly say in the introduction, a mantra for the conference, right? But Nyna, perhaps you want to say a little bit more about how this was conceptualized then in the book.
Okay. So when the three of us got together and decided that we would turn this into a book, certainly from the inspiration given by Gayatri, we spent hours and hours debating what this notion of cognitive damage would be and so on. And so I'm going to try to unpack it a little bit for you, but starting off with that seminal address by Spivak in 2014. And as we listened to her, I think what we thought at that moment was that we were listening, we were present at a post-mortem in which our bodies were being cut up. And a diagnosis was being made about what was happening and what had happened within our bodies, but more important, what had happened in our mind. And so we got to an understanding that we were witnessing the unpacking of a sophisticated type of mental capture. You know, we all know about state capture, but that state capture is part of this mental capture that all of us are victims of, in a sense. And so the idea got opened up that perhaps cognitive damage is much more widespread. And if anything, when Rubby spoke about underprepared institutions or students, it seems it's much more about underprepared humans, and almost as if we are subhumans, and that this kind of damage is taking place in the absence of physiological damage. So it was not that you were carried as a baby and your mother dropped you, and you hurt your mind in some way or the other. It was much more subtle than that. It was much more invisible. So there we were being exposed to a curriculum in school, outside of school, in the social spaces, in political spaces which had captured our minds, captured our imaginations, made us into what we could not recognize ourselves until that moment when Gayatri spoke and revealed to us that we were all, in a sense, kind of damaged. So where does the damage occur and how does it manifest itself? It starts off perhaps in our homes, something called culture, something that we do repeatedly, and that becomes our mantra, that this is how things are always done, but that it might be the wrong thing. So in a sense, we become insensate and dead to the very things that we are doing. And in fact, at some stage, we were talking around how it's almost as if we had undergone some kind of a lobotomy. You know, we were comatose. So we were doing things without even being conscious of it. But the notion of cognitive damage, once you become aware of it, you kind of keep looking at yourself all the time to say, how am I damaged? Is it culture? Is it education? Is it ideology? Is it propaganda? Is it different kinds of truth? What is it that is operating and making us think in the way we do? And in fact, when I listened to Gayatri speak even this afternoon, and she spoke about Fanon and Foucault and all those great thinkers, and I think about how much I'm steeped into all of that theoretical domains, but how I really don't understand what it means to live it out in the way that she demands us to do so. So this kind of moving from the arrogance of our education, of our culture, of our ideology, to a space of epistemic humility, I think that is the hardest movement. And I just began to think today that I'm really a theoretical fraud working within the space of these post-structural thinkers, but really not being able to translate it into a praxis, into a definite change, because there's so much comfort in theorizing. You know, it's so easy to talk about decolonization as if it's something that you can just talk about, but to go about and do it is something else. So you can see how cognitive damage occurs. We're not even aware of it. And I take comfort in the fact that all of us are damaged. And I think perhaps that is the key to kind of understand that just because we are academics, because we have PhDs or we are professors, that puts us in a better space. In fact, the more the education, the more the cognitive damage. I think that's what we would agree with. So, and I'm constantly with damaged people.
Stop pointing these ways.
It's the men, you know how it is. The more you hang around with them, the more damaged you are.
Let's just disrupt this idea.
Thanks, Nyna. I saw people writing frantically, so I'm sure they're going to engage you on this notion just now. But I'll give Michael a chance to. Michael, in another life, was an architect. And so I think to a large extent he's the architecture behind the book. Am I right?
If you want something done,
you ask Michael to do it.
Ask Michael to get a group together and make sure that you just not talk about it forever and actually organize some way of putting it together, pulling it together. And I think that was my task. And really, even in doing so, I want to indicate that we came to the concept of disruption in the title actually at the end of the book.
That's right.
And it's very interesting is that we were also, even in the process of constructing the book, attempting to advocate an alternative. And we kept saying this is antithetical to the very stance that we had originally started out with. And how do you create then a structure in a book that allows for all of that multiplicity to come forward? And so my job was really to pull together as diverse a set of voices in the book. So in the book you have ranging from architecture to life history research, to drama, to music, performance studies, to law and management studies, to art, to humanities, to gender studies, religion, all of it. And each of those individuals had something to contribute of their own understandings of what disruption actually meant. And when we think about the emergent idea of disruption that comes from the book, we saw disruption as very strongly linked to what a lot of readings were of the negativity of the decolonial fees must fall, roads must fall debate in the South African terrain. And in fact, when we started to examine the chapters again, every one of the chapter authors was saying this was an opportunity. Yeah. It was a space, it was a way of asking the awkward questions. And so each of the authors chose to elaborate on where they themselves are positioned, how their disciplines have come to be positioned, and whether there's time for more permeable boundaries between our what I call discipleships, the way in which we become followers and complicit in propping up particular kinds of essentialisms. And so the book is divided into three parts. The first part is of those individuals who felt were not as concerned with the operational issues, but really on the philosophical musing, the kind of problematizing the challenges theoretically. And the second is exploring specific shifts that people were attempting to make. And were they successful? What were the impeding challenges that constrained them from going in that particular direction? So the book in the end closes with, is it possible to dream a dream of a curriculum without borders? And what would it mean? Like we have Doctors Without Borders, could we dream about a new ethical consideration of thinking about higher education curriculum without borders? And if that happened, would that make us uncomfortable, discomfortable? And as Uma said earlier on, how we enjoy the moment of that uncertainty, celebrate it, and be able to see its potential for new imaginative ways.
Great, thank you. I think it's a lovely introduction actually to the genesis of the book, how this came to be. I'm going to open up to to our audience for questions, comments, things you want to know about. I think you'd welcome even process questions, right? Because particularly editing a book with these three here who are very strong-headed couldn't have been easy. But maybe we have some questions about the book overall. We'll come to individual chapters just now.
By the way, what you see is the 10th version of this book as the final version that actually came through. And so you can imagine how many times the authors were rewriting and reimagining their chapters as we go.
Again, as an author, I can attest to that. I see a question over here.
Yes, I'm Catherine Olson. I'm in music. I just wanted to ask you, how do you deal with this with this experience that many of us have of the institution that is something that we expected to hold in awe, that we look at it and we valorize it. Oh no, this is how the institution functions, and at the same time reconcile that with this desperate need to seek alternatives and to address that very issue of who are we teaching and what are we trying to teach them? You know, what for?
I think one of the recurring themes in the book is the instrumentality of institutions, the way in which we become commodified, the way in which we become essentialized, the way in which we are categorized in terms of performances. What the authors repeatedly show in the book is that they transcend those kinds of issues to say the performativities will take care of themselves if you push your agenda much higher. So in fact, your PUs are well covered and extended way beyond if you pay attention to the ethical dimension, in my opinion. The consideration of, for what are we doing this? Are we doing it for attention to self? And I think that's very often the case in many of our academic, what I call intellectual masturbation, a way of engaging with self-fulfillment instead of asking, what are we engaged with education for? And how are we contributing to the wider growth, the economic, social, political, cultural development of students in its fullest sense?
But Gayatri Spivak also deals with this question in her piece, actually, in the book, and I picked up on it earlier. Universities are a great weapon for us, she says. The university needs to be used. Yet, when a vision is institutionalized, it is the laws of institutionalization and disciplinarization that take over rather than the power of the vision itself. The beginning of what seems like success is actually the beginning of problems. So I think that's the issue that you touch on. A good chapter to read. Did you want to say something, Nyna or Rubby?
I sort of can identify with the crisis you're articulating. And there was a time when I was under the naive misconception that institutions are these monoliths, bricks and mortar, with their own lives, impenetrable and indestructible. And then I came across the work of Robert Chia, who's a fairly nondescript academic working somewhere in the United States. I think he's Japanese. And he led me, or rather inspired the belief that institutions are no more than the souls that inhabit them. It's the minds that assent or contest narratives that construct the institution. And we allow that to happen. And I think what we've experienced at UKZN in the recent past is many academics and those in leadership who decided to take back the university because it was going in some direction which was antithetical to what higher education stands for. I'm not celebrating that. I'm not saying there's anything inherently meritorious about it, but I'm saying that we need to be vigilant about not externalizing our responsibility to hold the institution accountable, especially when our aspirations are being squandered.
Thank you. Can I get Nyna, or is it a direct?
Okay.
It's a link into one of the chapters in the book, does the history of 64 representations of UKZN over a 100-year period in its legacy institutions right up to its present moment, and talk about the way in which different individuals in those institutions chose to remember and reconstruct images of what is UKZN. And so from that, the book is suggesting curriculum is also how we read our spatiality.
Thank you. Nyna?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that what you're raising raises broader issues around voice and agency. So if we just see what's happening in the country at the moment, suddenly there's a flurry of consciousness raising. People are finding their voices and now saying the things that are wrong with state capture that they've witnessed for so many years and been part and parcel of it as well. And I think in academia, similar things happen because we feel that it's not our place to speak up, or that we should not be protesting or saying the opposite of what is being tasked of us. And I think all of us have to realize that at some stage you've got to stand up and speak up. And sometimes what you're asked to do is the very thing that could liberate you. So if I take myself, when I joined UKZN as a permanent member of staff in 2009, I cursed every morning because I knew I had to write a piece to publish. But I'm very grateful for that emphasis, because if I did not do that, I would have just been a glorified high school teacher pretending to teach in a university. I'm very proud that I'm now able to produce knowledge. So I've used what was a technocratic function into something that serves me as well. I don't know if it will liberate anybody else, but it has certainly given me some money to attend conferences and go and talk nonsense elsewhere. So
I'm going to be careful that this doesn't become about the politics of the institution and open up for more questions.
Some of those things, I'm not saying everything about, it's really in our imagination and in a lot of the students' imagination, it's this thing, the institution that is held in so much awe. But in fact, just what you were saying about capturing your mind, we are, as agents of the institution, often responsible for that very capture because we're feeding it.
Two points that chapter stands out for me is specifically the issue of our own complicity in the agenda. That we've learned very craftily to externalize the source of the problem. And what she suggests to us is a metaphor of slow cooking. I recommend the chapter just to read its conception, which has evoked other iterations now of the slow professor. Please don't misunderstand what that means. Because what she's saying is that very often in our activist zeal, we take on an agenda that believing that if you act quickly and responsively, you are acting ethically and correctly. And so therefore, the opportunity to slow down the pace, to be able to understand deeply what you are implicated in. And as she indicated in her talk today, to be able to realize you're not going to solve everything. You're not the savior. But you are part of a solution. And that solution will change. And that be comfortable with that changing solutions.
Slow cooking. I remember that was also one of the mantras of the conference. Other questions, comments, any forms of engagement? Yes.
My question is as an outsider, because I don't teach at the university, I'm a health professional in a public hospital. So on the one hand, my question is a bit facetious, because it almost seems odd that a bunch of academics at the institution within which they work would write a book about changing the curriculum, because why don't you just go and change the curriculum? But on the other hand, I understand there's a broader kind of philosophical question about the nature of the university and the commercialization of education. And it almost seems like you're fighting against the tide, because, I mean, the commercialization of education is a global phenomenon. I mean, this very university has a division called corporate relations, you know. So on the practical level, why isn't the curriculum just being changed? And on the other hand, the philosophical question is, isn't this book just fighting against the tide?
Okay, maybe Rubby.
Because I know Rubby's going to use his lovely phrase, tinkerings with the curriculum.
Yeah.
Well,
Sorry, Michael.
No, that's fine.
Remind me to include that as part of the answer. But I think inherent in your question is an answer. We found as teacher educators and curriculum activists, we're curriculum activists, by the way. But what we found happening was there's a lot of noise. Even as we speak, there's a lot of noise around curriculum. And curriculum has been, from all its complexity, been reduced to sound bites in the form of decolonization, sorry, that's a bit of a tongue twister, but you know what I'm talking about. And so when we conceived of this book, we wanted to complexify curriculum. We wanted to elevate the discussions to beyond curriculum as having an essentialized meaning. And in fact, if you look at the discourse around curriculum, it has been narrowed to mean content. Curriculum is content. And we were saying no. It's, yes, certainly content is but one component. We face a far more formidable challenge, and that is reconceptualizing the structure of the curriculum, which has its roots elsewhere, but which we slavishly choose to internalize and perpetuate. Curriculum is also about pedagogy and now technology. And so you cannot oversimplify a complex discourse into one convenient buzzword around content. And so, yes, Michael, sorry.
Yeah, no, I just want to add to the issue of Chat's chapter, for example, from music education, raises the debate about, are we in the death throes of universities as knowledge producers to begin with? Is knowledge being produced better, more socially relevant elsewhere? And if so, why should we be engaging with this higher education format? And I think it's very interesting to listen to it coming from a discipline such as music, to be asking the same question in architecture. Where are we drawing these mantras of practice? How have they been embodied? Where do they come from? Who are we including in the construction? So as Rubby is suggesting, what the book is opening up is, it's a complex, messy, and wonderfully imaginative terrain, not simplistic.
So just, sorry, I just want to latch on to...
See how these men boss me,
Yes,
but
yes.
it's fine.
I'm being quite silent about
She
it.
will have the last word, be assured. You asked a very significant question. Why aren't we doing curriculum? And yes, that's the challenge we're now moving into the future with. We first needed to locate ourselves philosophically, ideologically, theoretically, in getting a sense of where we are at and where we need to go. My new mantra in 2017 and going forward is, let's stop pontificating about curriculum. Let's start doing curriculum. And in fact, today I sent out calls for funding proposals to identify where are the bottlenecks that prevents us from reimagining curriculum for those for whom it's intended. And so I'd like at some stage, the fact that you are at this seminar shows that you have at least an interest in curriculum, and for you to be part of this interdisciplinary team of researchers who will start by interrogating curriculum structure. Why do we have a 3-year or a 4-year degree with this bizarre credit accumulation model, which students, by the way, have learned to manipulate?
Tinker.
Yes. Is it possible to re-envision a new degree program, a new shape of what it means to graduate? I don't know. I don't have the answers. But the answers do reside somewhere out there in the work that you are doing.
Nyna, finally,
Yeah,
the best word.
so the idea of curriculum change almost kind of implies something positive. Now, in this country, we've seen a lot of curriculum changes, just looking at the school level. And we know how disastrous that has been because they haven't used Despacito, going it slowly. If you listen to Justin Bieber and Yankee Daddy and so on. But the idea of change, that we should just do it, I think is highly problematic. And so that is one of the things. Do we really need to change? Should we change our thinking? Should we sort of fix up the cognitive damage before we enter that space? And I think that is what we try to do in the book, is to say, let's stand back and disrupt this desire to just go and do some changing. And that is why even the book ends about the future directions, because we don't know whether those are directions or misdirections. So we should be really careful of change, and maybe not changing is also a way of changing. So just a little bit of standing back.
I'm going to take one more question and then we must move to the contributors because I know Professor Spivak needs to go back because she has a Skype call that she needs to make. So I'm going to take one more question and I'm going to ask you to be quite brief in your responses. Yes.
Thank you. My name is Jay Govender. When Nyna first mentioned the idea of cognitive damage, I was really upset with her. Cognitive dissonance maybe, but not this permanent sort of damage thing. I think intellectual labor has been challenged by two forces, the global one and the groundswell. I think we're actually in between that. Piketty and everyone else, who's been speaking about inequality, social justice, and so on, explain it very neatly to us. But I think the categories that we don't quite get is what the young people are actually trying to say to us. And globally, young people are saying, look, that classical economics is absolute nonsense. And this protest movement has spread across the globe. All the young people are actually saying it. Here they're saying to us, look, it's this decolonization. So you might not have a content here, it might not be a discourse yet for me. But I still think there are some very powerful messages that maybe we ourselves are just not getting. So to self-blame, I think, is actually self-defeating. Whereas the project really is to understand the context that we find ourselves in.
But be careful that that context that the youth automatically have the solution is also a capitulation. Because if you do let's take a statistical analysis and do an analysis of what youth want. They want an econometry, they want a place that academia must produce work-ready graduates, they want individuals to be able to take positions in the labor market. That's what they claim that they want. Is that what they need? And I think that's the challenge for us from a point of view of curriculum designers, that you can capitulate to that contextual force. And in the end of chapter 1, that's what we exactly do. It's a reconciliation between these multiple tensions, national, global, individual, personal, institutional relations. All of those pull and push in different directions. And as curriculum designers, we are constantly at the interface between those multiplicities of tensions. And I think if we just simply capitulate to say, okay, if youth want a completely new system, and that is what we're going to give them, is that the direction that's what Nyna is asking the question. Is this change, or is it just simply a capitulation to something that might produce some other forms of inequity? It will always create a question about who is it going to marginalize in the process.
So to add to that, this contextual force that you're talking about, do we have a complex understanding of that contextual force? Because who are the students who are demanding this? Who are the youth that are demanding this? Do they represent all or do they represent some? And I think that's the question for whom, as Spivak brought about very clearly in the first seminar that we had today. So we've got to think really carefully about how complex this picture is. And perhaps, as I said in the opening statements, is that the more educated we are, the more distanced we become from the larger masses. That is part of our cognitive damage. And the task that we have to do with first is to deal with our damage. How do we undamage ourselves? How do we unclog our brains from the kind of education which tells us how to read people, how to see them, how to understand, and we're running with a lot of our own assumptions. And I think that, so it might lead to some form of paralysis, hopefully for a short time, before we jump into it.
Thank you, Nyna. Last word from Rubby.
You sure?
Yeah.
So I want to support both what both Michael and Nyna said regarding, do we capitulate to these neoliberal demands? And they are neoliberal demands. But I must also concede, Jay, that we leave students out of these. If we are serious about knowing who is this curriculum for, surely students need to be part of that the debate, and they're not. Often they choose not to be, and I speak from experience. When students rail against you for not including them, but then simply exclude themselves from every opportunity, it happens repeatedly. And I think the challenge for us is to find some magical inclusive way to include their voices, as misdirected as they might be.
Oh, sorry.
That there's a causal relationship between higher education and the labour market. That's the belief.
Okay, I'm going to keep that question for a launch conversation with our contributors, and maybe it might be picked up in a little while, because I think some people might feel quite strongly that there is a causal link, and perhaps that's the debate about moving from instrumentalization to intellectualization, and what happens in that space in between.
I recommend Cribben's chapter.
Yes.
To answer that particular very issue, and Bert Olifier's chapter, which is a philosophical elaboration on what does it mean to be in a post-human condition.
Okay, so with that, I'm going to thank the editors for giving us an overview of the book, and certainly some tasty tidbits about what might be in the book. It's now my pleasure, thank you, to invite the contributors.
This nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal.
Mysterious power that pervades everything. I feel it, though I do not see it. It is this unseen power which makes itself felt and yet defies all proof, because it is so unlike all that I perceive through my senses. It transcends the senses